very consequently Ukrainian conscious and very much involved in the work of the Catholic Church in Saskatoon. Indeed, the founding meeting for the parish, which is now the Cathedral Parish, was in my parents' living room, and in 1912. And Dad was the choir director and the perpetual secretary of the parish council, and on and on. We then, in the mid-30s, when the Ukrainian Nationalist Organization was formed in Saskatoon, we became very active, all the 5 children, in the Ukrainian National Youth Federation. And it was from this background that I then joined the forces with a very strong cognizance through the family of my Ukrainianism.
What motivated you to join the armed forces?
Everybody was doing it, I suppose, but also there seemed to be a very good justification because we were very cognizant of Nazi Germany and the order in which Hitler was establishing, not only for Germany but for all of Europe and consequently the world. And that was an incentive to, it gave us a social justification to go and try to defend Canada as we knew it.
Were you familiar with the Nazi ideology at the time?
Yes, yes, it was living anywhere in Canada at that time. You couldn't help but be aware, particularly after what took place in Czechoslovakia, what took place in Poland, and prior to that, even going back to the Berlin Olympics, it was very evident to anybody living in Canada that took the time to notice that Nazism was a very strong and threatening dictatorship, as was, of course, fascism in Italy, and everybody saw what the Italians did in Ethiopia, and on and on. And this was known at that time as an unholy alliance, which one way or the other had to be fought, plus some element of Canada being a member of the Commonwealth, to some extent still thinking of the British Empire, that if Britain was going to go to war, then it must be a good reason to go to wars for Canada.
Was there any question in the minds of the youth joining that during the First World War, the Ukrainians, having mostly come from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had been on the so-called enemy side? Was there any motivation in proving the patriotism of Ukrainians as good Canadians in joining the armed forces?
I think perhaps there was some small element of that. My father, of course, having come in 1911, lived the First World War in Canada. And when the war broke out in 1914, he'd only been here 3 years, which was insufficient for citizenship acquisition, because at that time it took 5 years. And he had to report weekly. Indeed, he had a job with the city, with the Parks Department. And when the war broke out, he was fired and fairly quickly got a job with the Canadian National Railways, to where he worked until he retired at 65. But he had to report every week, once a week, to the police in Saskatoon. There was an awareness, to answer your question, that Dad knew that while he was of Ukrainian origin and had very strong ethnic leanings, he was also a Canadian, and that the future of he and his family was going to be in Canada, and as such, the Ukrainians in Canada could and must not be considered a second-rate citizen. And one way certainly to do that was to go and fight for the country which you had chosen to be your home.
At the time you joined the Canadian Armed Forces, were you at all aware of Hitler's plans for Ukraine?
No. Although I was a reader of the Ukrainian ethnic press, and while I was reading a lot of that, as indeed I worked at the newspaper called The New Pathway on Saturdays while going to school, I think the fear at that time was greater of what the Russians were going to do, particularly since we had all lived with vivid pictures of the Great Famine of the mid-30s. And it was Russia who was perceived to be the big enemy of Ukraine, although Hitler was certainly looked upon as the great enemy of Canada and the rest of the world. And when the two of them signed an alliance, it was, the feeling was, I think, general that the two evil empires had got together and somewhere are going to chew each other up eventually. But that was more, I think, a sort of a background feeling as opposed to being very clearly thought of, particularly by young people like myself, in that I was, at the outbreak of the war, only 18.
When the German forces invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 and the Soviet Union became Canada's ally, did this present any problems in your thinking or your friends?
Not greatly. It was rather taken as a fortune of war. Russia, it was deemed, had no alternative once Hitler attacked but to fight against Germany. And it was, I think, again, looked at as the treachery of one dictator to another. And the fact that they were Canada's allies, the Russians, seemed to me, at any rate, a good thing, in that they were going to eat up quite a few of Germany's military forces.
When you were in Southeast Asia, were there any other Ukrainians with you there?
Well, just coincidentally, not many. There were certainly some, but there was one particular chap who seemed to follow me around in the Air Force, by the name of Paul Uswell. Paul lived in rural Saskatchewan on a farm, and his parents decided he should come to Saskatoon to go to high school, where the standards were somewhat better. And he came and lived with us, with our family, for the best part of his high school. And we both belonged to the Ukrainian National Youth Federation, and we're very close to each other, of course, both being of the same age. I left for pilot training, and eventually, as I mentioned previously, through England and to the India-Burma-China front. Who should turn up on the squadron again but Paul? And we renewed. By this time I was an officer and Paul was still an airman. But things there were so informal that rank had very little significance. It was, if you, those who watch MASH today and see the informality in uniforms, in messing facilities, in every regard, those are just about the circumstances we lived in. And so Paul and I had a lot of opportunity to spend a lot of time together again. And as a matter of fact, one incident I would relate, Paul had expressed a desire to me that he would like to go on a mission, either troop dropping or supply dropping or whatever. And I was on a night mission one time, my crew and I, and asked him if he wanted to come along. And he said he'd be delighted, so he came with us on this mission. And now at this time we had no second pilots in the aircraft, and Paul sat up front with me in the second pilot seat. And as we were returning from our mission back to base, it was night, we reminded ourselves of some of the songs, Ukrainian songs we used to sing back at the choir in Saskatoon, both church choir and the other civilian choir. And we were singing away merrily there. What I hadn't noticed was that the transmit button on the microphone was inadvertently on. And it had been on all the time that we had been on the mission. Because at that time, you must remember, we had to maintain radio silence in the air because of the Japanese fighters in the area. And this singing had been broadcast all over North Burma, which nobody could really pin down as to the significance because there was no identifying means. And as a result, when we got back to base, intelligence had already had the word that there was some strange language and singing taking place over the operational zone. Paul and I never ever admitted that it was really us, and fortunately we were never found out.
Looking back from today on those years, one is sort of struck by the attitude of the Ukrainian Canadians in the armed forces, that after having spent several years in the war, that they, so many of them volunteered to stay longer and spent so much of their time in helping the Ukrainians in Europe. What do you think was the motivation behind this?
I think the cognizance of Ukrainians, particularly those that grew up in Ukrainian communities, or where there were a lot of Ukrainians, and where they were organized into church parishes and other ethnocultural Ukrainian organizations, having grown up in that environment, you know, Ukrainians do cluster. They tend to be rather clannish people, whether it's family, organization, or even as Canadians when they're outside the country. And I think that was probably the major factor in making them very aware of the history of the Ukrainian people and quickly then assessing the situation which presented itself.